Good day, everyone. I am Peter, your moderator for this webinar on the behalf of the organizer company called Conference Panel. I welcome everyone for today's webinar, which is called Informed Consent Update Maneuvering of May 2021. I would like to now introduce our presenter for today. She is my all-time favorite speaker now for hospital in this webinar. So her name is Laura A. Dixon. She served as the Director, Facility, Patient Safety and Risk Management and Operations for COPIC from 2014 to 2020, where she provided safety and risk management consultation and training to facilities practitioners and staff in multiple states. Ms. Dixon has more than 20 years of clinical experience in acute care facilities, including critical care, coronary care, paraoperative services, and pain management. She served as the Director in Western Region Patient Safety and Risk Management for Doctors Company, Napa, California. So now I would like to hand over the floor back to our speaker. Over to you, Ms. Dixon.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. And I just want to re-echo his welcome to everyone for joining us today. As Peter mentioned, we're going to be talking about informed consent. Informed consent's been battered around as far as what you have to do, who can provide it, what are the requirements, and of course the requirements from CMS, Joint Commission, they've all changed over the years. And so that's why it's always a good idea to have a refresher on it, to revisit what is required. So let's start off with a brief introduction on informed consent. Now, as we all know, and we probably heard it repeatedly, it's a process. It's not just a form. Now, technically, surgery is to work just like a well-oiled machine, just like clockwork. Well, this study happened to find that that may be fine, but in 60% of the surgeries, the consent forms weren't even there. They were completely missing. And really, it caused a problem, especially when antibiotics had already been started. And those were timed antibiotics, the hour before incision. Now, does that result? 10% of the surgeries had to be delayed because that consent form couldn't be found. That resulted in lost or misplaced. It was an average cost of over $500,000 a year to those hospitals. So again, this is by Johns Hopkins that they did this. What about a lack of consent or even not doing consent or obtaining consent when you have an off-label use of a medication? You wouldn't think that would be such an issue, but it is. What informed consent provisions are we talking about? Well, that's a tough one because first off, you have to know what the standards and guidelines that are present and as they apply to you and or your specialty in practice. As far as hospitals in general, now we all know hospitals themselves don't practice care. They don't do that. They provide the vehicle, they provide the care in a way. Those that do accept Medicare and Medicaid, they have to follow certain rules and regulations, not just your licensing rules, but also those that apply to CMS. Or Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. Those rules are contained in the conditions of participation, which essentially is that you want to participate, these are the conditions you have to meet in order to be reimbursed for Medicare and Medicaid. And this applies to all hospitals, whether it's your pay-per-service, your acute hospitals, your critical access hospitals. That's the 25 beds or less. Well, speaking of CMS, why are we doing this? Well, because you don't want to get a deficiency report, or in other words, a citation based upon what you've done. Now, the nice thing is we can access it. We can get information on what CMS has cited other hospitals for. It is a form. I'm going to show you how to get to this report. It lists the tag numbers. It lists the names, the addresses of the hospitals. It lists the date of the survey, and there may be a brief description of what they found. It does not include, though, the plan of correction, which some hospitals find beneficial because if they're looking at a CMS coming out or they've had an issue, it's nice to know what somebody else did and how they fixed it. These reports are updated quarterly, and the way you would do it is enter that email, that internet access site that I put on this slide. This is slide number 11, by the way. When I look at the tag numbers and I try to identify what were those deficiencies, these are the ones we're going to talk about today in particular. What were the deficiencies in particular? What were the issues that the surveyors identified? So again, it starts in the Federal Register, and then CMS comes along and inserts their interpretive guidelines. This is what we believe that you need to do in order to meet this regulation. Now, this is the appendix overall for the entire manual. It lists out the type of facility and the appendix letter that goes with it. So informed consent. In Appendix A, there are 3 sections on informed consent. Informed decision and patient right. There is one, a medical record, which also includes a minimum requirement for a consent form. In critical access, you have 2 sections, tag C1110 and C1140. If you're a critical access hospital, you have a separate distinct rehabilitation or a separate distinct behavioral health unit. You go under Appendix A, not W. And in particular, whose responsibility is it for informed consent? Many will use that team-based approach. However, from Pennsylvania, a Supreme Court ruling may throw a wrench in that. And it happened to do with a patient ended up with a puncture of the carotid artery. As a result of that case, well, what happened is the patient was actually supposed to have a different surgery done. And here they'd had a perforation of the carotid artery when they were doing the craniopharyngioma. Now, what happened was that wasn't supposedly included in the consent. Now, the physician, the surgeon, said, no, there's no way. I had a conversation. I told him this could happen, and it didn't matter if it was a subtotal or total. We talked about it. Well, this is one of the old adages that if it's not documented, it wasn't done. Now, any good lawyer will tell you, no, that's not the case, and that there is so much that we do anyway. It doesn't get into the record, but nonetheless, doesn't mean it didn't happen. What about the medical records section? Now, this is, again, where the great deal of information on what has to be in that informed consent form, what is responsible, what's required. Well, let's now move over to critical access hospital. Again, there were two sections that talk about informed consent. You do have your own manual, Appendix W, interpretive guidelines. They've been updated. It is available online. Now, I want to point out one thing. Back in 2020, CMS changed all of the tag numbers for critical access hospital. And by the way, some of these aren't all finalized. Clinical records, that's the first section for your critical access. That's where they put it. The record includes evidence of a properly executed consent form that is signed by the patient and or representative, and they're given enough information, explanation about the consequences, the options, about the procedure itself to consent. And that includes evidence of that properly executed form for any procedure or surgery that the medical staff has determined needs one or is required by federal or state law. The next section with critical access is in your surgical section, 1140. Now here they include all inpatients and outpatients, just as did the acute hospitals. And so the patient's told who will actually perform the surgery. In other words, no ghost surgery. So we have to tell the patient if a practitioner other than the primary surgeon is going to do important parts of that procedure. Resident, somebody else coming in to do it. And even if it's under the surgeon's primary supervision, you have to include which tasks they will be carrying out. Well, that's the CMS conditions of participation. What about Joint Commission? As they have a whole bunch of standards as it relates to informed consent. It's in the patient rights section or their chapter, and also the record of care, which, if you'll recall, this is pretty much what CMS conditions of participation are. DNV, they have consent standards, and I will tell you, when I read through their standards and compare them to CMS, they almost mirror each other with what they say. In fact, informed consent, they're pretty much the same as the conditions of participation. They're one of the accrediting organizations, just like Joint Commission, where you can get deemed status in order to get paid. They're available on their website. You don't need to pay for them. They're available at no charge. The patient rights section alone, they have for what they call PR on informed consent. Very well. Well, again, I want to thank everyone for attending today. Feel free again to reach out to CMS if you have additional questions or if you want something clarified in today's program. Reach out to me by email. That's usually the best way to reach me. So with that, thank you. And I will go ahead and turn it back to Peter to close us out.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, participants. So with this, we conclude the session for today. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. Have a great day. Thank you.